Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. Today, the emphasis on the word beyond. We're going beyond boxing to talk about Greg the Hammer Valentine. He is an extremely colorful character of a pro wrestler that I wanted to cover on this podcast. And of course, without the colorful characters of professional wrestling, there would be no characters of boxing and beyond podcast, because the characters that are in the ring with pro wrestling just kind of dovetail nicely with some of the most fantastically colorful characters in the history of boxing. So today I will tie it back a little bit to boxing, because someone who went ahead and trained Greg the Hammer Valentine also fought Muhammad Ali in a very interesting match that we'll talk about. A little bit of a mixed martial arts type match that we'll talk about in later in this podcast. So Jonathan Anthony Wisniewski, born in 1951, that is Greg the Hammer Valentine. He is the son of a legendary pro wrestler by the name of Johnny Valentine. Now, Johnny Valentine was a legend in the old NWA wrestling promotion throughout the 1940s and 1960s, which was its own golden era in professional wrestling. And, the reason I wanted to cover Greg Valentine is because he's an all-time great heel. He's an all-time great villain. There is no question about Greg Valentine being a colorful character, known with the long flowing blonde hair. He looks like he is straight out of central casting when it comes to professional wrestling. And inside the ring, as a technician, everything that Greg Valentine does is so solid. Every punch he throws, every kick he lands, every elbow he throws in the ring is just done with such craftsmanship, and it's so solid, and there's no wasted movements with what Greg Valentine does inside the ring. In fact, of course, to bring it back to boxing, it reminds me of George Foreman when Foreman made his comeback to the ring in boxing in 1987, I believe, when he was ready for that second stage of his career. Foreman did not waste any energy. He was solid as a rock. He took a lot of blows, but had an incredible chin and never wasted any energy. And when he was ready to throw the knockout punch like Michael Moore found, that's kind of how Greg Valentine was in professional wrestling. Just solid as a rock, doesn't move very fast. Of course, Foreman didn't move very fast either, but these guys don't waste any energy in the ring, and they're solid, and that's something as a spectator of both professional wrestling and boxing that I always enjoy seeing. So Johnny Valentine, of course, was Greg the Hammer Valentine's father. And in 1975, Johnny Valentine was involved in a very serious plane crash. It was a private plane that was on the way from Charlotte, North Carolina to Wilmington, North Carolina, kind of, flying over the entire state of North Carolina. And the plane crashed, and inside that plane was a bunch of pro wrestlers, including the legendary Charlotte-based wrestler Ric Flair. So Ric Flair and Johnny Valentine both broke their back in that flight. The pilot ended up dying of his injuries sustained in that fight 2 months after the plane went down. Ric Flair, of course, came back and captured multitude of wrestling titles and became one of the most hugest pop culture icons in professional wrestling after this plane crash. But for Johnny Valentine, Johnny V, he would never wrestle again. He had to retire due to the injuries he sustained in this private plane crash coming in 1975. And Johnny Valentine would never wrestle again. And he, of course, also led the rest of his life with a lot of nagging injuries and a lot of pain. I think Johnny Valentine was in a lot of pain the rest of his life because of this plane crash that he was in 1975. And he never wrestled again, and Johnny Valentine died in 2001. So in the 70s, maybe a handful of years before Johnny Valentine's plane went down, in about 1970, Greg Valentine, drops out of college and he wants to get involved in pro wrestling just like his father. Um, and of course, these two gentlemen are from the Seattle, Washington area. No longer does Greg live in that Seattle, Washington area, but him and Johnny are both natives of Seattle, the Great Pacific Northwest. And not a lot of wrestlers that I know of that came out of Seattle, not a lot of boxers that I can think of that come out of Seattle. Of course, maybe the most famous boxer to come out of Seattle is a character that we profiled on this podcast before, and that, of course, is the great boxer Greg Haugen. So Greg Valentine now decides he's going to get involved in professional wrestling, drops out of college, starts training under the legendary Stu Hart, the Calgary, Alberta-based Stu Hart, of course, with all the legendary sons that he had wrestle, Owen and Brett, the most famous among them. Stu Hart had this wrestling promotion in Calgary, I believe it was called Calgary Stampede, and he also had this training facility in his basement known as the Dungeon, where he would break wrestlers and while training them and kind of put them in submission holds. And it was a famous kind of pro wrestling iconic place where Greg Valentine trained in the early 70s in that kind of mansion, that Victorian mansion in Calgary that Stu Hart trained all these great wrestlers, including his children, who were perhaps some of the biggest names in pro wrestling ever. So Greg Valentine trains there, and then first, he does not take the name Valentine. Of course, Greg Valentine's real name is Jonathan Anthony Wisniewski. His father's surname Wisniewski as well. But Greg Valentine doesn't want to take on that Valentine surname, that fictional, that kayfabe last name of Valentine right away. He doesn't think he might be able to live up to all that his pops did. His dad had this huge legacy in professional wrestling. His father was an incredible wrestler, legend. And so he starts out his career as Babyface Nelson. Eventually, Greg Valentine switches his name to Johnny Valentine Jr., but that was a short-lived name. He didn't go by Johnny Valentine Jr. long because his father, this was before the plane crash, was still active in pro wrestling. And, of course, they thought maybe, it wasn't the best idea to have Johnny Valentine looked at as an old man who has a son, who's already pro wrestling. So, as a compromise, they billed Greg Valentine as Johnny Valentine's brother, and that's when he took on the name Greg the Hammer Valentine, aka Johnny Valentine's brother. And in 75 and 76, Valentine travels to Japan, and he takes on some training with legendary Japanese wrestler Antonio Inoki. Antonio Inoki, also a politician in Japan, a businessman promoting pro wrestling in Japan. Antonio Inoki, very respected wrestler, maybe the most famous Japanese wrestler that ever lived. And in 1976, boxing fans might know about Antonio Inoki because he faced Muhammad Ali in a real match where Ali was allowed to box and Inoki was allowed to wrestle. Of course, this match is fully available on YouTube and well covered on YouTube and the internet, and it was kind of an early form of mixed martial arts, so to speak. Inoki was throwing real kicks. He was allowed to do a lot of kicking and grappling, while Ali was boxing and throwing punches, and it ended up being a really bizarre event, kind of a dud, to be honest. Not a lot of action because Inoki was on his back most of the match trying to throw kicks, and it didn't allow Muhammad Ali to get in there and to land any punches, so it kind of just was this long drawn out stalemate. Inoki, he's like on his back the whole time, scooting around, and Ali actually took a lot of kicks to the legs, and he later had blood clots from it. It's just a really bizarre early form of mixed martial arts where they didn't have the rules figured out yet, because certain people were allowed to do certain things, and Ali landed some punches, and I'm sure they caused some damage, but it didn't really, to me, have a clear winner of who actually came away the winner. And then later, Muhammad Ali, because he took so many kicks, ended up being hospitalized with blood clots. So Antonio Inoki did train Greg the Hammer Valentine right around that same period that Muhammad Ali and Antonio Inoki entered the ring together in that bizarre exhibition match. So after training with Inoki, Greg Valentine comes back to the United States, wrestling in the Charlotte-based Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling promotion. And at that point, he did form a tag team with the legendary Nature Boy Ric Flair. So from 1978 to 1998, Hammer Valentine wrestles in the WWE/WWF, a lot in that Mid-Atlantic promotion, and he also joins the short-lived United Wrestling Federation. My best memories of Greg the Hammer Valentine was as this heel guy with the long flowing blonde hair. Again, just prototypical looking professional wrestler with that bleached blonde hair. And I have memories of him coming in the WWF in wrestling, maybe in like 93, 94, 91. He was in and out of the promotion, spent a little time in WCW, and he just came in and kind of was a mid-card guy, wasn't at the top main eventer at any time when I was watching pro wrestling. But he came in and he had those long flowing robes, that classy robe. Of course, Ric Flair known for the robes as well, those long flowing, beautifully crafted robes that he rocked. He just always caught my eye. I always liked him. I always was happy when he was out there. He had that figure four leg lock, just solid as a rock, like we were talking before, with how he maneuvered about the ring and all the punches and kicks that he lands and throws. So I did do a little bit of reading about him before that. And I was reading about how he was in this tag team, kind of most famously, his most famous tag team was called the Dream Team, and they operated from 85 to 87, and that was in the WWF, and at the time known as the WWF. And he tagged with Brutus the Barber Beefcake, who was around when I started watching pro wrestling in the early 90s, was tagging with Hulk Hogan by the time I started watching pro wrestling. So he tagged with Brutus Beefcake in a golden age of tag team wrestling, when you have guys like the fabulous Rougeaus, Raymond Rougeau and Jacques Rougeau, who are brothers from Quebec. You had the Hart Foundation. I think those were the early days of the Hart Foundation, with Jim the Anvil Neidhart, rest in peace, and his brother-in-law, I believe his real-life brother-in-law, Bret the Hitman Hart. And then you had the British Bulldogs. You're talking about, Davey Boy Smith and the Dynamite Kid. So Tom Billington, I believe, is that guy's real name. And I think he recently passed away as well. But those guys were high flyers. That was a golden age of pro wrestling, tag team wrestling. And Greg Valentine was right there in the middle of it with the Dream Team. So when I started reading more about the Dream Team, you always have to have a sense of humor if you're a pro wrestling fan, because you have to just know how silly it is and how ridiculous it is. And so I was reading about this tag team, and I couldn't tell if they had real life tension between Greg Valentine and Brutus the Barber Beefcake or not, because at some point what I was reading, it said that because there was a lack of a title won by the Dream Team, tensions between Greg Valentine and Brutus the Barber Beefcake ensued. And I didn't really know if that was like real life they were having tension, or if it was kayfabe, which is professional wrestling storylines. So I still don't know if that was a real beef the two had, or if they just, that was the storyline, that they had some beef because neither of them could win a title. I still don't know. But, you gotta have humor. And then, of course, because they had that beef, they dropped Brutus the Barber Beefcake from the tag team, that legendary Dream Team tag team, and in came the world's strongest man, Dino Bravo, another French-Canadian who died very young in the early 90s. Very mysterious and sad, untimely death for Dino Bravo, the world's strongest man. Dino Bravo wrestling with the fleur-de-lis on his tights, of course. Very fun. And he tag teamed with Greg the Hammer Valentine, and they finished out that era of the Dream Team from '85 to '87, one of their most famous tag teams. The Rhythm and Blues tag team was the next real marquee tag team that Greg the Hammer Valentine would go ahead and be a part of. That was a tag team with legendary Intercontinental Champion Honky Tonk Man. And Honky Tonk Man and him tagged in 90, 91. This was a very hated tag team. They were probably some of the best heel tag team ever, as far as how much heat they could draw. And at this point, you're talking about Greg the Hammer Valentine dyeing his hair jet black. Dyed his hair jet black, played pretend like fake guitar. He was definitely a huge character there, tagging with the Honky Tonk Man. But yeah, he dyes his hair black, and then at this point, there's a for anyone who's a big time collector of professional wrestling toys, there is a very rare Hasbro manufactured toy, I believe, of Greg Valentine with the black hair, and it's known as like the most rare Hasbro collector's toy ever made. And of course that's out there for, there's a couple of them in existence known in circulation, and they go for like $15,000. So Greg the Hammer Valentine, again, being a part of wrestling history in these collector item toys, when he was tagging with the Honky Tonk Man as part of that Rhythm and Blues tag team that had Jimmy Mouth of the South Hart, who in real life was a real musician, Jimmy Mouth of the South Hart. From 90 to 91. And Jimmy Mouth of the South Hart, I met in person once at a book signing in Aurora, Illinois, I think it was. And he was signing a book with Hulk Hogan, and couldn't have been a nicer guy, Jimmy Mouth of the South Hart. I hear a lot of good things about him when people run into him in person, and I can attest personally, he was a really good dude. And yeah, he was a real life, he was obviously the manager of Rhythm and Blues, and he was a real-life musician. He wrote a lot of the early music for the World Wrestling Federation before they kind of had a newer guy come in-house and write all the titles and music for them in that, WWF/WWE company. So nowadays, Greg the Hammer Valentine, he lived a long time in the Clearwater, Tampa area, as so many professional wrestlers seem to retire to that oasis on the ocean there, or on the Gulf of Mexico there on the west coast of Florida. Hammer Valentine living in Clearwater for a long time. You might have seen him on shows like Hogan Knows Best. Of course, Hulk Hogan lived in that area, probably still lives in that area for a super long time. His real life brother-in-law is Brian Knobbs, one half of the Nasty Boys tag team, famous for their pit stop finisher. So yeah, he was in Clearwater for a long time, but then I heard in an interview that he did, a real interview that he did recently, that he had moved to Las Vegas. And Greg the Hammer Valentine spending a lot of his time at the Caesars Sportsbook in Las Vegas, according to this interview I watched with him, being interviewed by Devin Hannibal, a wrestler who does a lot of shoot interviews. And in this interview, Hammer Valentine said that, he's in Vegas, he's at the Caesars Sportsbook all the time, and he sees fans that come up to him and, ask him how he's doing. And I always thought that it'd be really cool if I was in Vegas and at the sportsbook. It's a great sportsbook, probably the best sportsbook in Vegas, one of the best. And it'd be cool if I was there and I was watching some college football or something and stumbled upon Greg the Hammer Valentine, because it sounded like he's very willing to talk to fans, and he actually likes being recognized. So, professional wrestling Hall of Famer, and he's also a WWE Hall of Famer, class of 2004. Had to cover him on this podcast. One of the all-time great characters, with just the look, the robe, the long blonde hair, and also maybe one of the greatest wrestling villain heels of all time. Pro Wrestling Illustrated named him the most hated wrestler in 1975, 1979, and 1983. So, it's an absolute skill and talent to be able to draw heat, to be able to have people feel negative energy towards you to the point where they're going to buy tickets and they're going to tune in. That's an important aspect of marketing yourself as both a pro wrestler and a boxer. If fans aren't going to love you, then darn make sure they hate you, so that at some point they're interested, because the opposite of love is not hate, or the opposite of love in this business is not hate, it's apathy. The worst thing that someone can feel about you as a boxer or a professional wrestler, if you're trying to make some money in this game, is apathy. And Greg Valentine never left the fans apathetic. He, of course, drawing great heat throughout his entire career, and he might make some appearances here and there in the independent circuit. I'm sure he does some signings and all that type of thing, autograph signings and whatnot, but he has been pretty much retired as far as I know, since those days of the final days of the WCW in 96, 98. That was kind of his last big appearance in professional wrestling before kind of semi-retiring to the independent circuit and the convention circuit and the autograph, kind of circuit. So Greg the Hammer Valentine, had to give him a shout out, going beyond boxing today on the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. I love watching him as a kid growing up, followed his career. Just think he's one of the best heels ever, one of the most interesting in-ring performers there ever was. Of course, I'm a huge pro wrestling fan. This podcast is about boxing, but we got to dive into all types of characters. And Greg Hammer Valentine, chief among them when you're talking about all-time great characters. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Characters of Boxing and Beyond podcast. We'll catch you next time.